So we are out here in the garden. We're going to start trying to divide things, and I'm just going to show you how easy it is. So this is some coneflower, Echinacea, and I'm just going to take a clump out. I'm going to use the pull it all up and break it apart method, and we'll see how easy it is to come out. So you probably want to find the bottom of your clump and start loosening. Give it about, I don't know, maybe 6 inches to a foot around the bottom of the clump. Stick your fork in the ground, step it down a bit, and loosen it. Loosen the soil. Sometimes you'll find that it's harder to get underneath all the roots, and sometimes it's easier. You just have to sort of pay attention to what the plant is doing as you're rocking the fork back and forth. See, as you can see, this one wants to come out pretty nicely. So, we've got our clump of Echinacea. Just going to set it down on the ground on the tarp. And for this, I'm going to take the 2 forks, put them in side by side, or excuse me, back to back. You might want to work to find like a middle point, but it's not super critical. Also depends on how big your clump is. And I'm just gonna sort of move the forks back and forth to loosen up the root ball. I don't want to use too much force because I don't want the whole plant to break. But at the same time, if this happens, see how I've gotten some of it off, but not all of it, and this sort of is broken. But
here, bring that up close.
That's okay because there's still roots attached. So if you're careful with this and replant it right away or put it in a pot, you should still be able to see some success with this, and I'll explain about that when I'm done. So I'm going to set this aside because it's still viable. And this one I'm going to pick up and see. So the root ball is kind of all jammed up together. This is not a huge clump, so that's part of the problem that I'm having, and the prominent stalks are quite large, so this may not break up as easily as I think. I'm going to try it one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'll use a different method. There we go. So now we have more than one plant. Here's one, probably 2 if we really wanted to divide it further. We've got another with a nice root section on it, and yet another with a nice root section on it. So what I would do, and let me just, before I go on, I'm not sure how many of you saw the different ways I was moving the forks. I did it this way. That wasn't really working. So then I pushed the handles together. Sometimes that just allows enough force to pry the roots apart, and that's what ultimately worked. You may also find, depending on what your clump is, that going like this is helpful. You're just going to have to take your cues from the plant.
So when you say not using too much force, can you explain at what point would you have stopped and said, maybe this plant doesn't want to be divided?
Well, I would say that if it's becoming really difficult for you to pry the thing apart and a lot of it is breaking, and you find that the pieces that are coming off don't have roots, maybe consider a different way of doing it. You know, it's kind of hard to explain theoretically, because you really have to be working with the plant to see what it needs. Echinacea is pretty hardy, so it's difficult to kill, and even if you lose some pieces, it's okay, because you can see that we have a lot of it that's worth replanting. And maybe, okay, so what I might do with some of the clumps, like you can see how this one, all right, so it looks like we lost one because this has no roots attached. It's possible that it could grow roots, but I'm going to call that one a loss, and that's okay. But this, see how it has just a little. What I might do with something like this, rather than try to plant it in the ground right away, I'd probably pot this up. And what's going to happen with this, as well as the ones you put directly in the ground, probably what will happen within a day is that it'll start to wilt. And you'll say, oh my God, I've killed it. You haven't killed it. Relax. Remember, it's all an experiment. And you put this, you've got it potted, and when it starts to, what you want to do is cut. And that will help reduce the transpiration of the moisture in the leaves, so that the plant works not to hydrate the leaves, but to grow the roots. So with this, if I was going to replant this in the garden, I'd make a nice hole, loosen up the roots, add some compost if you have it, and just cut the tops off, because there's a lot of plant here for it to try to get water to. So I'm going to make that a little bit less trouble for it.
Do you want to leave any leaves so that it photosynthesizes, or is that not the issue right now?
I think it depends on when you're doing it, and I've done it both ways. I've had it where there were no leaves left, and I just had stalks. I've had that work. Usually that works better when they're in pots. At least that's my experience, because I do a lot of experimenting with this stuff at home. I usually like to leave some leaves on, because I feel like that's stored energy for it to use. You think that's...
Yeah. I would say this, if we're doing, like right now we're talking about fall divisions.
Yeah.
I don't think leaves are nearly as important, because your plants aren't photosynthesizing anywhere
They're
near
getting ready to go to sleep anyway.
Right.
If you're doing this, well, first of all, one of the things I think we talked about already is don't be doing this in the middle of the summer.
No.
It's too hot. It's generally too dry, especially it has been dry for this past couple years. So you really don't want to do that. That said, if it's like, I must divide this now, take a risk. It's your own garden. You can do what you want.
And we've had situations like, I know people who are like, I'm moving and I need to take my plants with me.
You need to take your plants with you.
Or we're redoing, the septic tank, and someone's digging up this whole thing.
Right.
So if you have to, you have to. It's fine.
You have to, you have to. And what I would say for times like that, when you're doing it at a not particularly ideal time, if you can, wait for a cloudy day. If you can't, dig it up. Try to get your site prepared in advance. Replant the items right away. And then provide it a little tent of sorts, so that it will give it some shade.
Right, even full sun plants need shade after transplant.
After transplant, full sun plants will want a little bit of shade, just because they've been through a little bit of a trauma. So some people use like an upside down milk crate to provide some shade. I've also had you can sort of make a little tent with burlap and put it over top, maybe with some, tie the burlap to some stakes, and just to give it a little bit of color. You could also cover. You could also use like an umbrella. Take an umbrella and, prop it up and have it just shading it from the worst parts of the sun.
And, I'm going to say one thing about us doing this today in this film. It rained yesterday.
Yeah.
It rained really nicely, which means that today, actually 2 days ago, it rained really nicely.
It rained last night too.
And last night. Which means that today the ground is softer.
Yeah.
And everything's more pliable, and the plants are going to be more receptive to being...
It's certainly helpful. But I will also say that it rained. It rained this past week. But this soil, it's pretty nice, but there's still a bit of dryness. So
let me get Liz here.
So certainly be aware of how dry it's been. This is not bad. I would maybe like to see a bit more moisture, but that also highlights the importance of watering after you do this. So once you've planted your clumps, make sure that you water really well. Let's just say I'm going to replant this here.
And one thing I like to remind people about watering is that it may feel like you watered a lot, but oftentimes once you dig down a little bit, you'll see that the water only penetrated the top maybe couple of inches.
Or it just got the mulch wet.
Or it just got the mulch wet.
Yeah. So now that this is replanted, you're going to want to water it all around the root ball for a good bit, because you saw that it wasn't totally wet, or maybe you couldn't see on the film, but it's not as wet as it should be. So you want to make sure you give it a lot of moisture. And then what also helps is if you take a little bit more mulch and mulch just around the root ball, to try to preserve the moisture that you just put into it by watering. And I would say when you do something like this, you want to give it water maybe once a day for a week. That's usually what I tell people. And some people have varying success with less or more or whatever, but I usually do it. If I transplant something in my garden, I usually water it once a day for a week, and then after that I will drop back to twice a week or once a week. So are there any questions?